Picture London in 1665, the largest city in England. Home to nearly 500,000 souls, spreads across both banks of the Thames like a living organism. Church spires puncture the skyline every few blocks. Merchant ships crowd the river so densely you could almost walk across their masts from one shore to the other. The Royal Exchange bustles with traders from Amsterdam, Venice, and the Levant. Coffee houses overflow with philosophers debating the nature of the universe. This is the age of Christopher Wren, of Samuel Pepys, of scientific revolution and commercial empire. The city that would soon rebuild itself in classical splendor after the Great Fire appears in paintings as an orderly paradise of commerce and culture. But walk those same streets at dawn, and the romantic image dissolves like morning fog over the Thames. Before the sun rises, a peculiar migration begins. Thousands of people emerge from timber-framed houses, carrying chamber pots, buckets, and containers of waste. They move with practiced urgency toward specific locations, not because they want to, but because they must. The city has no sewage system, no running water in homes, no sanitation infrastructure of any kind. Every bodily function, every drop of dirty water, every scrap of refuse from 400,000 people must be manually transported somewhere. The question of where defines the entire rhythm of urban life. The city measures roughly 1 square mile within its ancient walls, though sprawling suburbs push far beyond. 30 parishes divide this space, each with its own church, its own poor, its own problems. Houses stand 3, 4, sometimes 5 stories tall, timber frames leaning so close over narrow streets that neighbors on opposite sides can shake hands from their windows. These aren't the broad Parisian boulevards that won't exist for another century. Most streets measure barely 12 feet across. Some alleyways with names like Stinking Lane and Foul Lane that tell their own story allow passage for only a single person at a time. Within this compressed space, humanity layers itself by function and class in ways that would seem impossible to modernize. Ground floors, house shops and workshops. Merchants and craftsmen occupy second floors. Families crowd into third-floor rooms, often 8 or 10 people sharing space barely larger than a modern bedroom. Attics, shelter, apprentices, and servants. Cellars store goods, harbor rats, and flood regularly when the Thames rises. Every vertical foot of space serves a purpose. Privacy, as we understand it, simply doesn't exist. The official population stands at 400,000 in 1665, but this number counts only permanent residents. Add the constant flow of sailors, migrants from the countryside, foreign merchants, refugees from continental wars, and the real number swells far higher. The city absorbs newcomers at a rate of thousands per year, yet its physical footprint barely expands. Buildings grow taller instead of outward. Families subdivide rooms. Landlords convert every closet into rentable space. Density increases until the very air feels compressed. Even stranger are the patterns you notice after a few days. Certain street corners attract crowds at specific hours, though no market operates there. Residents avoid particular alleys even when they offer the shortest route. Wells that should serve as gathering places stand mysteriously empty, while others have lines stretching down the block. Some churches lock their doors except during services, which seems inhospitable until you understand what happens in their yards at night. The city operates according to unwritten rules that govern the most basic human needs. Break these rules, and social consequences follow swiftly. The truth about 17th century London was as basic as it was inescapable. Nearly 500,000 people lived without a single feature we consider essential to urban life today. Water, the simple substance that covers most of Earth's surface, became, within city walls, the most complicated problem of daily existence. London had the Thames running through its heart, one of Europe's great rivers, visible from thousands of windows and doorways. Yet most residents couldn't drink from it, couldn't easily access it, and couldn't rely on it for their most basic needs. The river served primarily as the city's main sewer, receiving the contents of hundreds of drainage ditches, countless privies, and the runoff from slaughterhouses, tanneries, and dye works. Drinking Thames water directly was possible only for those desperate enough or new enough to the city not to know better. Instead, Londoners depended on a network of public pumps and conduits that delivered spring water from sources outside the city. The entire metropolis of 400,000 people relied on perhaps 24 major water sources. Do the mathematics. That's roughly 15,000 to 20,000 people per functioning water source. Some parishes had even worse ratios. In the densely packed neighborhoods around Cheapside, a single conduit served an area housing 30,000 souls. Lines formed before dawn. Water carriers, usually women or children, waited for hours, filling buckets and barrels to haul back to their households or to sell door to. A single family's daily water needs might require a dozen trips. The wealthy had options. They paid water carriers premium rates for delivery service, Some great houses had private wells, though the water quality varied wildly depending on what their neighbors dumped into the ground nearby. The New River Company, established in the early 1600s, piped water from springs in Hertfordshire to a reservoir in Islington, then distributed it through wooden pipes to subscribers in wealthier neighborhoods. But piped water in 1665 meant something very different from modern plumbing. The water flowed to a cistern in your cellar or courtyard. You still had to carry it bucket by bucket to wherever you needed it, and the service cost more than most laborers earned in a week. For the majority of residents, water meant waiting, hauling, and rationing. A typical household might have access to 20 gallons per day, total for drinking, cooking, cleaning, and all washing. Compare this to the modern British average of 35 gallons per person per day. In 17th century London, an entire family made do with less water than one person uses now for a single shower. The scarcity shaped everything. Cooking methods evolved to use minimal liquid. Cleaning meant spot washing rather than immersion. Washing clothes became an elaborate quarterly event rather than a weekly chore. Bodies received attention from dry cloths more often than wet ones. The hierarchy of water access revealed itself in countless small ways. Wealthy households washed their hands before meals, a luxury that required both water and a servant to pour it. Middle-class families might manage hand washing once a day. The working poor made do with whatever water remained after drinking and cooking needs were met. Samuel Pepys, the famous diarist, noted his own wife's excitement when they could afford regular delivery of water for washing. This from a man who worked in the Navy office and lived comfortably by London standards. If water for washing was a notable expense for the Pepys household, imagine the calculations made by a family of 7 living in 2 rooms on a laborer's wages. Street vendors recognized the market. Fresh spring water. They called, selling buckets door to door at prices that fluctuated with the weather. During droughts, water prices could triple overnight. Some entrepreneurs specialized in sweet water from particular springs, marketed as superior for drinking. Others sold Thames water for washing and industrial uses at cheaper rates. The water trade employed thousands and occupied a significant portion of daily commerce. It also created opportunities for fraud. Unscrupulous sellers filled buckets from the Thames and claimed spring water origin. Without chemical testing, buyers relied on taste, smell, and reputation. But the problem of acquiring water was only the beginning of the city's hydraulic nightmare. If obtaining water required elaborate daily effort, disposing of what water became was even more challenging. Remember, no sewers, no drains, no pipes carrying waste away from buildings. Every household generated gallons of dirty water daily from cooking, from washing hands and faces, from cleaning dishes and floors, from chamber pots and closed stools. All of it had to go somewhere, and that somewhere was always someone else's problem. The wealthy had cesspits. These underground chambers, lined with brick or stone, collected household waste beneath courtyards or gardens. When full, perhaps every few months, night soilmen came after dark to empty them, a process so unpleasant that it commanded premium wages and happened only between midnight and dawn. The contents went into carts and traveled to fields outside the city, where farmers paid for the fertilizer. This system worked tolerably well for those who could afford it, though the cesspits leaked constantly, contaminating wells and creating sinkholes when they collapsed. Many houses built in the 1500s were settling unevenly by the 1660s, their foundations undermined by decades of seepage. Most Londoners lacked private cesspits. They depended instead on public privates, essentially communal cesspits with wooden seats built over them, often serving entire neighborhoods. These structures clustered in churchyards, in alleys, behind markets. The one serving the area around Cheapside accommodated perhaps 20,000 users. Lines formed. People waited. The smell became so characteristic that residents navigated by it, using phrases like "turn left" at the privy as legitimate directions. The facilities operated 24 hours because demand never ceased. Even at 3 in the morning, you'd find people waiting their turn. But public privies filled quickly and emptied slowly. Night soil men could only work so many hours of darkness. Demand exceeded capacity constantly. The solution became both obvious and problematic. People stopped waiting. Upper-story windows became convenient disposal points. Every morning, chamber pots were emptied into the streets below, sometimes with a warning cry of "Gardez-l'eau," corrupted from the French "Gardez-l'eau." Watch out for water, but often without. Walking London streets required constant vigilance and quick reflexes. Buildings with overhanging upper stories were particularly hazardous. You couldn't see what was coming from directly above. The streets themselves had open kennels running down their centers, or along their edges shallow gutters meant to carry rainwater and whatever else toward the Thames. In theory, these kennels drained into larger sewers that emptied into the river. In practice, they clogged constantly. Garbage, animal waste, human waste, dead cats, rotting vegetables, broken pottery, and every other form of refuse piled up until someone hired a scavenger to clear it. Who paid for this service depended on local politics and often sparked disputes between parishes, landlords, and residents. Some streets went weeks without clearing. Medical wisdom of the era held that water opened the skin's pores, making the body vulnerable to disease. Bathing, especially full-body immersion in hot water, was considered dangerous, except for treating specific ailments. Most people went months or years without anything we'd recognize as a bath. Instead, they relied on dry cleaning, rubbing the skin with linen cloths to remove dead skin and oil. Changing undergarments served the same purpose as bathing in modern terms. The wealthy changed linen shirts daily and considered this the height of hygiene. The poor owned perhaps 2 shirts and alternated them weekly. This approach created its own problems. Without regular washing, linen absorbed weeks of sweat, oil, and skin. It yellowed and stiffened. The smell became distinctive. To mask odors, people used perfumes, pomanders, and scented sachets. The more expensive the scent, the higher your social status. Courtiers at Whitehall Palace doused themselves in French perfumes. Merchants favored lavender and rosewater. The working classes made do with cheaper herbs like mint and thyme, if they used anything at all. The result was a city where smell operated as a class marker as visible as clothing. Hair presented particular challenges. The wealthy wore wigs, which could be cleaned separately from their heads. Natural hair was dressed with powders and pomades that absorbed oil but never actually cleaned. Combs and brushes removed loose dirt and parasites, a process that occupied considerable time daily. Women of means had servants who spent hours maintaining their mistress's hair without ever washing it with water. The elaborate hairstyles fashionable in the 1660s could take days to construct and would last weeks, becoming homes to more than just hair as time passed. Teeth decayed rapidly, without modern hygiene. Most adults over 30 had lost several teeth. Toothpicks were luxury items, crafted from silver or gold for the wealthy. The middle classes used sharpened quills. Breath was universally problematic, masked with herbs like mint, cloves, or anise, chewed constantly. Tooth drawers operated in barber shops and markets, extracting rotting teeth without anesthesia. The procedure was so common that it appeared in street entertainments traveling. Performers pulled teeth publicly to prove their skill and attract customers. Markets opened before dawn and closed by midday because food spoiled quickly. No refrigeration meant everything was purchased fresh daily, or preserved through salting, smoking, drying, or pickling. Wealthy households sent servants to market early to get the best selection. By the time working-class wives arrived after completing their morning chores, the freshest items were gone. This wasn't just inconvenient, it directly affected health. Spoiled food could only be identified by smell and appearance, both unreliable measures. Many illnesses traced back to contaminated food that seemed acceptable when purchased. Meat hung in butcher stalls, uncovered, covered with flies in summer. Bakers' ovens operated in cellars and ground floor shops, their heat making entire buildings swelter. Fish came up from the Thames wharves, transported in carts through streets already warm, arriving at market hours after being caught. Milk traveled from farms in the countryside, sometimes a full day in transit before reaching city dairies. Spoilage wasn't occasional, it was constant and expected. Cooks learned to use heavy spices and strong sauces not primarily for flavor, but to mask the taste of meat that was no longer quite fresh. The wealthy ate relatively well by era standards, with access to imported spices, sugar, and preserved delicacies. A merchant household might have meat daily, fresh bread, cheese, beer, and seasonal vegetables, but even they faced limitations. Their food was prepared in smoky kitchens by servants working over open fires, carried through multiple rooms before reaching the dining table. In summer, flies landed on every dish. In winter, food arrived cold despite servants' best efforts. The grand feasts depicted in paintings were real, but they represented hours of preparation and armies of servants. And even then, the food on those tables bore little resemblance to modern standards of freshness or safety. The poor survived on bread, pottage, cheese, and beer. Meat appeared on their tables rarely, usually in heavily salted or smoked form. Vegetables were seasonal and expensive. Many families allocated half their income to food and still struggled to get enough calories. Chronic malnutrition was so common that it seemed normal. Adults stood several inches shorter than modern averages. Children's growth was stunted. The connection between diet and health was poorly understood, though people recognized that starvation led to weakness and illness. All these realities converged to create an urban experience that contrasted dramatically with any romantic notion of 17th-century city life. Stand in Cheapside at noon on a summer day in 1665, and the full weight of the paradox becomes clear. Around you rise some of London's finest buildings, the newly renovated Goldsmiths' Hall, Merchant houses 4 stories tall, with glass windows that represent fortunes. Churches with bells that cost more than most people will earn in their lifetimes. Well-dressed merchants conduct business worth thousands of pounds. Coaches rattle past, carrying nobles to appointments at Whitehall Palace. Street vendors hawk goods from around the world: silk from China, spices from the East Indies, sugar from Caribbean plantations, wine from France. This is the commercial heart of an empire in the making, a city that will soon dominate global trade. Yet that same intersection serves 30,000 people with a single conduit for water. The streets you're standing on haven't been properly cleaned in weeks. The open kennel running down the center contains things that would make a modern sanitation worker recoil. The smell is distinctive enough that visitors comment on it in their letters, home not as an occasional problem, but as the permanent character of the city. The same merchants conducting £1,000 transactions will walk home through refuse, climb stairs to cramped quarters, and sleep in rooms that share walls with strangers. Grandeur and squalor don't just coexist, they're inseparable. This wasn't unique to London. Paris, with its 500,000 residents, faced identical problems. Amsterdam, despite its famous canals, struggled with water quality and waste disposal. Madrid's population of 150,000 overwhelmed its infrastructure. Venice, surrounded by water, still couldn't provide clean drinking water to its residents. The pattern held across Europe. Cities grew far faster than the technology and organizational capacity to sustain them. Every major city of the 17th century was simultaneously a triumph of human organization and a public health catastrophe waiting to happen. Some recognized the problems. Sir Christopher Wren, after the Great Fire of 1666, proposed rebuilding London with wider streets, proper sewers, and planned water distribution. His vision included public fountains, underground drainage, and zoning that would separate residential areas from noxious industries. The plans were brilliant, far-sighted, and almost entirely ignored. Property rights, the cost of implementation, and the urgent need to rebuild quickly trumped long-term planning. The new London that rose from the ashes was built of stone instead of timber, but it kept the same medieval street plan and the same inadequate infrastructure. Why? The answer reveals the era's priorities. Grand architecture, military power, colonial expansion, commercial dominance, these commanded attention and resources. The idea that government should provide basic sanitation and clean water to all citizens simply didn't exist yet. These were private problems, household concerns, matters for individuals to solve through their own efforts and resources. The notion of public health infrastructure wouldn't gain traction for another 2 centuries. Until then, people adapted. And adapt they did, with remarkable creativity. Social protocols evolved to manage the unmanageable. Walking on the right side of the street, keeping to the walls in narrow alleys, calling out warnings before emptying chamber pots. These weren't just courtesy, they were survival strategies. Fashion adapted to long coats, protected lower garments from street filth. Shoes became elaborate affairs with thick soles and buckles that could be cleaned easily. Hats kept falling debris out of hair. Every element of 17th century dress served practical purposes we no longer need to consider. The health consequences were severe. Disease moved through crowded neighborhoods like fire through timber. The plague that struck London in 1665 found perfect conditions: dense population, poor sanitation, contaminated water, limited medical knowledge. 70,000 people perished in a single summer, roughly 15% of the city's population. This wasn't unprecedented. Plague struck major European cities regularly throughout the 16th and 17th centuries. Typhus, dysentery, smallpox, and various fevers were endemic. The connection between contaminated water, poor sanitation, and disease transmission wouldn't be understood for another 200 years. Class determined survival. When plague struck, wealthy families fled to country estates. They could afford to abandon city businesses for months, to take their households to cleaner air and safer conditions. The working poor stayed, not by choice, but by necessity. They couldn't abandon their livelihoods, couldn't afford country lodgings, couldn't imagine surviving outside the city's economy. So they stayed and faced the consequences. The same pattern held for every health crisis. Wealth bought options. Poverty eliminated them. Yet people weren't simply victims of their circumstances. They built communities, despite the challenges. Parish systems provided basic welfare. Guilds supported members during hardship. Neighbors helped neighbors because everyone understood they might need help themselves tomorrow. The harsh conditions fostered both remarkable cruelty and unexpected generosity. Samuel Pepys's diary records both wealthy men stepping over the suffering in the streets and ordinary workers sharing their last bread with strangers. The changes came eventually, though not in the 17th century. London's cholera outbreaks in the 1800s finally convinced authorities that sewage and drinking water needed separation. Joseph Bazalgette's sewer system, completed in the 1860s, solved problems that had plagued the city for centuries. Clean piped water reached most homes by 1900. The transformation took 200 years from the period we've examined, but it happened because the alternative became intolerable. What does this reveal about the era? That beauty and brutality intertwined in ways we struggle to imagine. That humans created extraordinary art, architecture, and commerce while living in conditions we'd consider unlivable. That technological progress doesn't march steadily forward, but lurches in response to crisis. That the past wasn't quaint or romantic, it was hard, uncomfortable, often unpleasant, and yet people built lives, raised families, created culture, and found moments of joy within constraints we can barely comprehend. The 17th century city, for all its problems, worked. 400,000 people woke up each morning, found water somehow, managed their waste somehow, fed themselves somehow, and went about building one of history's great civilizations. They did it without a single convenience we consider essential. The fact that they succeeded doesn't make their conditions acceptable or admirable. Light makes their achievement more remarkable and their suffering more poignant. Next time you see a period drama set in London's golden age, admire the costumes and architecture. But remember, the camera isn't showing you the morning line at the water conduit, or the open kennel in the street, or the privy serving 20,000 people. It's showing you the same partial truth that paintings from the era showed: the impressive surface that covered a much more complicated reality. The city was grand. The city was filthy. Both statements are completely true. That's the paradox of historical cities. They were simultaneously humanity's greatest achievements and its most challenging failures. Proof of our capacity for both creation and endurance.